You are a useless waitress. Who employed you in my friend's wedding, and that, in fact, you are fired.
She humiliated a wedding waitress, unaware she was her mother-in-law. She sneered, just loud enough for the guests to hear, pointing at the old woman carrying plates, calling her useless, slow, embarrassing. She wanted everyone at the wedding to laugh, and they did. Everyone except the bride's childhood friend, who watched in silent horror. But the waitress wasn't just an old woman. She wasn't just a server hired for the day. She was someone's mother, someone's blood, someone's entire world. And the one disgracing her was the woman who would soon call her mama, her daughter-in-law, her son's bride, the girl he swore was kind, respectful, and well-raised. She didn't know the cameras were recording. She didn't know her fiancé was walking in behind her. She didn't know the stranger she humiliated was the very woman who gave him life. Now, the wedding isn't just a celebration. It's a revelation, a test of character, a moment of truth. Because in one careless moment, she didn't just disgrace an old woman. She disgraced her future. Music thundered through the hall as lights danced across glittering chairs and guests swayed in soft laughter, unaware that joy was about to shatter like thin glass. A sudden sharp sound sliced through the noise, not a broken plate, but a cruel remark launched like a spear towards someone defenseless. Heads turned, conversations died, and even the DJ's hand hovered over the mixer. Something in the air shifted, heavy and sour, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the bitterness. Yet no one moved fast enough to stop what was already spiraling into something darker. Guests leaned forward as the old woman staggered under the weight of plates, her hands trembling as ridicule wrapped around her like a rope. The woman responsible for the insult stood boldly, chest lifted, eyes shining with false superiority, as if cruelty were a crown on her head. People exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to intervene or pretend the moment didn't exist. But the humiliation hung like smoke, impossible to ignore. Something about the scene felt wrong, too sharp, too intentional, as if an unseen thread had snapped in the middle of the celebration. A wave of discomfort rolled through the hall, and whispers swept between tables like wind darting through tall grass. Guests who had been laughing seconds earlier now stiffened, their smiles fading into tight lines of confusion. The bride's childhood friend, standing closest to the scene, felt a cold ripple crawl down her spine as she watched the old woman shrink inward, trying desperately not to let tears fall. Something deep inside her warned that this wasn't just a harsh moment. It was the beginning of something that would stain the ceremony. And she sensed it wasn't over. Glittering chandeliers threw harsh light over the confrontation, making the old woman's trembling hands impossible to miss. Her blouse clung to her shoulders with exhaustion, yet she still tried to steady herself with quiet dignity. Across from her, the aggressor basked in attention like a performer on a stage, unaware that masks often slip when pride takes center place. The guests felt the tension stretching dangerously thin, as though the wrong word would push everything into chaos. And no one could predict how quickly that chaos was approaching. A child dropped a fork somewhere behind the dessert table, and the small metallic clang echoed through the hall with eerie clarity, amplifying the silence surrounding the old woman's pain. Even the band paused, waiting for anyone to intervene. But the moment dragged like slow thunder, deepening the old woman's humiliation. The bride's childhood friend felt her breath shorten as she studied the aggressor's satisfied smirk. She wondered how such cruelty could bloom in someone so young and poised. But even she didn't know that this act would unravel far more than pride. A strange heaviness fell across the room, as if invisible hands had pressed down on every shoulder. The old woman's eyes darted downward, but her trembling revealed the storm inside her chest. Around her, guests exchanged uneasy looks, whispers thickening like a warning cloud. Something about the aggressor's behavior felt deeper than mere arrogance. It felt practiced, familiar, like a pattern she had worn comfortably for years. And yet, she had no idea her audience today included someone who held her future in his hands. A gust of cool air drifted from the open doorway as someone entered behind the crowd, unnoticed and unprepared for the scene unfolding before him. But the bride's childhood friend saw movement from the corner of her eye, a tall silhouette pausing, frozen in confusion. She didn't turn fully, but something told her this figure would change everything. The tension in the room thickened, slowly pulling every gaze in one unavoidable direction. What no one knew was that the next few seconds would alter the wedding's destiny forever. Steam drifted from the catering pots at the back of the hall as the old woman moved quietly between tables, her steps small and cautious, as though she feared her presence alone might offend someone. The fabric of her apron clung to her thin shoulders, worn from years of washing and scrubbing. No one looked long enough to see the story her eyes carried, the ache, the memories, the weight of years lived without recognition. She walked as though life had taught her to make herself invisible. Yet today, invisibility was no longer possible, and something was about to expose her. Light from the chandeliers washed over her face, revealing faint wrinkles that traced years of sacrifice, loss, and quiet resilience. Her fingers trembled slightly as she balanced plates, not from weakness alone, but from the sting of humiliation still burning across her skin. She swallowed hard, steadying her breath, determined not to let anyone see the pain beneath her soft smile. But the more she tried to remain composed, the more her shoulders tightened, betraying her silent struggle. Somewhere deep in her chest, a fear stirred, a fear that this moment was only the beginning. Guests brushed past her without acknowledgement, lifting their glasses and adjusting their dresses as if she were part of the furniture. A group of young men laughed loudly near the drinks table, nearly bumping her as she passed, forcing her to pause and wait for them to clear the way. She bowed her head automatically, an instinct shaped by years of being dismissed. Every gesture revealed a life built around serving others while burying her own needs. But even this practiced humility could not shield her from the storm quietly gathering around her. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. A soft rattle came from the tray she carried, the plates vibrating against each other as her hands struggled to remain steady. She blinked rapidly, fighting the tears pressing against the corners of her eyes. Her dignity was the last thing she possessed, and she clung to it tightly. A nearby server noticed her distress and offered a sympathetic glance, but fear kept the woman from accepting help. She sensed that any misstep today would magnify her shame even further. And somehow, she felt that unseen eyes were already examining her too closely. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh pastries filled the hall, but the old woman barely noticed the aromas swirling around her. All she could feel was the heavy ache in her lower back and the faster rhythm of her heart as she moved between tables. Her breaths came short, like someone bracing for another blow, another insult, another reminder of her low place in a world obsessed with status. Yet beneath her trembling exterior, a small spark of endurance still burned, the quiet strength of someone who had survived far worse. A sudden gust from the air conditioner brushed against her neck, lifting a few strands of her gray hair and revealing a scar just beneath her collar. It was old, healed, and hidden by habit, yet it spoke volumes about the battles she had fought long before this wedding. She adjusted her apron quickly, hoping no one had seen it, but a few guests near the doorway paused, whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued by something about her that felt strangely familiar. They didn't understand why. Not yet. But recognition was coming, slow and inevitable. A soft thump behind her made her turn slightly, her eyes catching the shadow of a tall figure approaching the hall. She felt a strange chill run through her as if her spirit had sensed something her mind couldn't yet explain. The heartbeat in her ears grew louder, drowning out the music for a moment. She resumed her step, unaware that the person entering would open a chapter she thought life had closed forever. Unaware that her hidden identity was about to collide with her present in the most devastating way. Dee's friend shifted her weight uneasily as she stood near the dessert table, her eyes scanning the room with growing discomfort. The laughter around her no longer sounded joyful. It sounded forced, shaky, unsure. Something felt off, like a thread quietly unraveling at the edge of a perfect tapestry. She watched the old woman's shoulders curl inward as she moved, and each movement tugged at her heart like a warning. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't random. It was revealing something deeper, something everyone else was too distracted to see. A burst of confetti exploded near the dance floor, momentarily drawing attention, but her gaze stayed locked on the aggressor. She noticed the subtle smirk, the puffed chest, the self-satisfaction radiating like heat. There was no remorse in her posture, no hesitation in the cruelty she delivered. Instead, there was entitlement, the kind that grows slowly, fed by admiration and unchecked pride. The friend felt her stomach turn as she realized this wasn't a slip of temper, it was character showing itself. And yet, she sensed this revelation was only scratching the surface. The friend took a slow step closer, pretending to adjust a centerpiece while observing the server's reactions. They exchanged quick glances with tight lips, their faces carrying a mixture of sympathy for the old woman and silent fear of the aggressor. Their body language whispered a truth no one dared to say aloud. This behavior wasn't new. The friend felt a cold prick at the back of her neck as she realized the staff wasn't just shocked. They were used to this. But what were they afraid of? And why now? She brushed crumbs from her fingers, her eyes drifting toward the groom's family table. A few relatives sat unusually stiff, whispering quietly behind their hands. Their expressions didn't match the celebratory atmosphere. They looked unsettled, watchful, as though waiting for something to unfold. The friend followed their line of sight and noticed how closely they observed the old waitress. It wasn't casual or accidental. It was recognition mixed with worry. The realization tightened her chest. Why were they looking at the old woman like that? What did they know that no one else did? She moved aside as a waiter passed, but her focus snapped back when she noticed the groom's younger sister wiping her eyes discreetly. It wasn't from joy. It was something heavier, something weighed down by fear or shame. The friend's heartbeat quickened as she connected the dots. The sister wasn't watching the bride-to-be. She was watching the old woman with trembling concern. The friend felt a rush of unease swell inside her. Something emotional, something personal, tied the groom's family to that server. And whatever it was on the verge of breaking open. A low vibration buzzed from a nearby table as someone's phone lit up with a notification, a short recording of the earlier insult, already circulating among the guests. The friend watched the screen flash with the old woman's hunched posture and the aggressor's triumphant stance. Her breath hitched as she realized the moment was spreading faster than anyone could control. The recording captured something the bride's friend wished wasn't true, the aggressor's delight in power. And she feared the groom might see it before the bride even realized her mistake. She stepped toward the entrance just as a shadow stretched across the doorway, long and steady. The tall figure she'd glimpsed earlier now stood fully inside the hall, frozen mid-step as he observed the tension he walked into. She felt her pulse pound loud in her ears. The look on his face told her he had seen enough to understand something was terribly wrong. The friend's breath caught as she wondered whether he knew the truth behind the old woman's trembling hands. What she didn't know was that his world was about to shift forever. The bride's childhood friend inched closer, watching one guest tilt their camera further to capture the old woman's face, the exhaustion, the hurt, the moment her pride broke under pressure. It was an image that clung to the heart like a bruise. She swallowed hard, realizing the footage made the old woman appear far older than her years. Stress had aged her instantly. The aggressor's smirk in the background felt venomous when preserved in pixels. The friend sensed the recordings were no longer just observations. They were judgments waiting to spread. Near the back, someone lifted their phone higher, capturing the aggressor in full, her posture bold and triumphant. The camera caught the way she stood with her hands on her hips, as though the hall were her kingdom and the old woman her servant. But behind her, The camera also caught a silhouette entering, tall, frozen, stunned. The friend gasped quietly as she realized the groom had just walked into frame. His expression, sharp, heartbroken, and disbelieving, was immortalized before his fiancée even knew he was there. A sudden tremor rippled through the crowd as the video clip of the insult passed from phone to phone, spreading faster than whispers ever could. Guests huddled in quiet pockets, showing each other what they had captured, their faces tightening in horror. Every replay magnified the cruelty. Every zoom exposed another layer of disrespect. The aggressor's ego blinded her to the storm forming behind her, but the friend felt it, the shifting of loyalty, the quiet recoil of people who once admired her. Something irreversible had begun. The soft sound of a notification chimed from a corner as someone uploaded the clip to a group chat filled with family members. The bride's friend watched the screen blink with instant reactions, fear tightening her chest. Once a moment becomes shareable, it becomes unstoppable. She turned back toward the aggressor, who still hadn't noticed the phones, or the shifting energy, or the groom standing just steps away. The friend felt dread crawl up her spine. The truth was no longer whispered, it was recorded. And the next moment would decide everything. The groom stepped fully into the hall, his polished shoes halting mid-stride as a wave of confusion washed over him. The music continued, but to him it sounded distant, warped, almost muted. His eyes narrowed instinctively, searching the room for the source of the tension thick enough to taste. He scanned the tables, the guests, the decorators, until his gaze landed on the old woman trembling under harsh lights. His heartbeat faltered as recognition flickered in his eyes. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. And he sensed he had walked into the middle of a storm built for him. A heavy breath escaped him as he stepped closer, each footfall sinking into the marble with the weight of dread. He noticed the way guests parted subtly, as though making space without realizing it, not for celebration, but for truth. Their eyes avoided his, filled with guilt or anticipation. The groom's stomach tightened as he followed their line of sight toward the aggressor, who remained blissfully unaware of his presence. Her gestures were grand, her arrogance loud, her cruelty unapologetic. He felt his chest tighten, as if the room had shrunk around him. He paused near a flower pillar, watching the aggressor hover over the old woman like a shadow swallowing light. Every insult he overheard struck him like a slap, building a pressure behind his ribs he couldn't release. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightening as memories of his mother's gentle strength collided with the sight of her shrinking in humiliation. He felt something break inside him, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and devastating. And still, the aggressor continued her tirade, unaware the man she planned to marry now saw her through a new, shattering lens. Guests shifted uncomfortably as they noticed the groom standing motionless, his expression carved from disbelief and hurt. A ripple of murmurs traveled through the hall as a few guests realized he had walked in unnoticed. The bride's childhood friend felt her heart pound as she saw the anguish forming in his eyes, a pain deeper than anger. She knew this wasn't just embarrassment, it was betrayal. The groom stood rooted to the spot, unable to pull himself away, yet unable to step forward. What he saw was rewriting everything he believed about the woman he loved. The groom exhaled sharply as he caught sight of the old woman's trembling hands. His mother's hands, the same ones that had nursed him through sickness, fed him through hardship, wiped tears from his cheeks when life felt too heavy. Seeing them quiver under someone's cruelty crushed something fundamental in him. His vision blurred at the edges as the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. This wasn't just disrespect. It was an attack on the very person who shaped him. And the realization struck him with a force he could hardly breathe through. A small movement caught his attention, a woman subtly wiping the corner of her eye with her sleeve, trying desperately to hide her pain. The sight made the groom's chest tighten painfully, a deep ache blooming in the center of his ribs. He felt the urge to step in, to protect her, to stop everything, but shock held his feet anchored to the ground. It was as if he needed one more second to process the reality unfolding before him. And in that suspended moment, everything about his future began to shift. The bride's childhood friend watched the groom inhale sharply, his shoulders lifting with a breath that carried both heartbreak and awakening. She knew he was moments away from confrontation, moments away from shattering the illusion the aggressor built around herself. The crowd sensed it too, their whispers fading into a silent anticipation that settled like dust in sunlight. The groom stepped forward at last, deliberate and steady, his eyes locked on the woman insulting his mother. And although he moved quietly, everyone in the hall felt the ground begin to shift beneath their feet. The groom stepped into the open space between tables, his movements subtle, yet powerful enough to silence a cluster of nearby whispers. Light from the chandeliers washed over him, revealing the tightening muscles in his jaw and the storm brewing behind his eyes. Guests straightened in their chairs as they sensed something monumental approaching, the way air shifts before lightning strikes. The aggressor, still boasting in her shallow triumph, had no idea that the moment she had feared her entire life, exposure, was walking straight toward her. And nothing could stop what was about to unfold. The old woman felt a presence beside her before she saw him, a familiar warmth she had known since the first day she held him as a baby. She turned slightly, her tired eyes widening when she recognized her son standing there. Her breath caught, her fingers faltering around the tray she carried. Time seemed to freeze between them, a quiet exchange of pain, love, and devastation that needed no words. The aggressor continued her rant, now unaware she was humiliating someone whose identity had just been unveiled in the shadows cast across the hall. Gasps rippled across the room as the groom knelt beside the old woman, his posture collapsing with the weight of heartbreak. His hand trembled as he reached toward her, a gesture raw with love and disbelief. Guests covered their mouths, unable to tear their eyes away from the emotional collision happening before them. Even the music faltered, as if instruments themselves understood they were witnessing something sacred. The aggressor finally turned, expecting praise or validation, unaware that the walls around her carefully curated image were crumbling in real time. The aggressor's expression shifted from irritation to confusion as she saw the groom kneeling by the old woman, but her mind struggled to connect the dots. She blinked rapidly, as though her vision had betrayed her. The crowd pressed closer, their silence thick with expectation. Slowly, the truth crept through her chest like cold water. The groom wasn't angry at a server. He was heartbroken. And the old woman trembling beside him wasn't just an employee. She was someone irreplaceable. Something inside the aggressor cracked, but the revelation had only begun. The groom's shoulders shook slightly as he steadied himself, his hand hovering protectively near the old woman's arm. His body language spoke louder than any words could. This wasn't just a server he was defending. This was family. The old woman's lips quivered, her eyes filling with tears she had held back for far too long. The crowd whispered her name softly, a name some recognized but hadn't connected to the server before them. The aggressor felt heat rising in her chest, confusion turning into dread as understanding slowly pierced her pride. A tremor passed through the hall as the groom finally lifted his head, revealing eyes glassy with pain and betrayal. His gaze landed on the aggressor with a force that made her take an involuntary step back. She felt the room press in on her. The stares, the judgment, the collective disappointment. Every insult she had thrown at the old woman replayed in her mind like a cruel echo. And now she realized those words had not been spoken to a stranger, but to the mother of the man she was about to marry. The truth settled over the hall like a curtain dropping at the end of a tragic play. Guests held their breath as the aggressor's face drained of color, her confidence collapsing beneath the revelation. The bride's childhood friend felt her heart clench. This moment wasn't just shocking, it was defining. The groom rose slowly, his expression a heartbreaking blend of love for his mother and devastation toward the woman he thought he knew. And as the hall braced itself, everyone understood that this wedding had just transformed into a reckoning. The aggressor's knees wobbled as the truth slammed into her, heavy and merciless, like a wave swallowing a shoreline before anyone could brace for impact. Her breath caught in her throat, and her fingers twitched as if searching for something solid to hold onto. But the room around her blurred into indistinct shapes, faces twisting with disgust, disappointment, and shock. The bright lights that once made her feel powerful now exposed her like a thief caught mid-crime. She wanted to hide, shrink, vanish, anything but stand in the center of the humiliation she created. The music faded into background static as a suffocating silence took over, wrapping around her like a rope tightening with each passing second. The groom's gaze, heavy and unblinking, felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She tried to lift her head, to offer some expression that could soften the blow, but her face betrayed her, stiff, pale, trembling at the edges. Every mocking word she had fired at the old woman began replaying in her mind, each one twisting deeper than the last. And there was no rewinding the moment that destroyed her image. A tremor rippled through her arms as the crowd shifted, leaning back as though her presence carried something contagious. The laughter she once fed on evaporated, replaced by quiet disgust. Even those who admired her confidence now avoided her gaze, unwilling to attach themselves to her disgrace. She could almost hear their thoughts, like murmurs slipping through cracks in her pride. They weren't just judging her behavior. They were judging her character. And she realized, with startling clarity, that she had given them every reason to. Her heart pounded loudly against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she stood alone in a room full of witnesses. The old woman's trembling figure came into focus again, and guilt carved its way into her chest, heavy and sharp. She had mocked a stranger, but this wasn't a stranger. This was family she had never taken the time to know, respect, or honor. The realization burned like fire beneath her skin, spreading quickly, mercilessly. And the shame didn't just come from the revelation, it came from the knowledge that she had chosen this path herself. A sudden wave of nausea climbed her throat as she watched the groom gently steady his mother, their bond unmistakable. His hand on the old woman's arm was tender, protective, everything her words had not been. She felt the distance between herself and the man she was supposed to marry widen until it became an unbridgeable gap. His silence pierced deeper than any outburst could. It was the silence of disappointment, final, cold, and devastating. The kind of silence that redefines a relationship. She braced herself, knowing she had just lost something priceless. Guests began recording again, not out of curiosity anymore, but to capture the aftermath, the destruction of pride happening in real time. The aggressor felt their eyes crawl across her skin, branding her with their silent judgment. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to blame misunderstanding or stress, but nothing came. Her throat locked, her mind spun, her excuses evaporated under the weight of truth. She realized she had no shield left. Her mask had been ripped away by her own actions, and everyone was seeing who she truly was. The bride's childhood friend watched the aggressor's posture fold inward, her arrogance collapsing like a roof weakened by fire. She saw the fear hiding behind the woman's eyes, not fear of the crowd, not even fear of losing status, but fear of losing the future she had built her life around. The groom stepped back slightly, as though distance would help him breathe again. The aggressor staggered, unsure of where to stand or who she was anymore. And in the smallest second of silence, everyone wondered the same thing. What would she do next? Guests shifted in their seats as an icy wave spread across the hall, dissolving the last traces of laughter that once floated beneath the chandeliers. Fans stopped mid-swing, hands fell away from wine glasses, and the collective mood hardened into something cold. All eyes drifted toward the aggressor, not with admiration, but with a quiet, simmering judgment she wasn't prepared for. She had always craved attention, but not like this, not the kind that exposed character instead of beauty. A whisper traveled through the crowd. This woman had just rewritten her reputation in one fatal moment. Clusters of guests leaned together, their heads bowed in tense murmurs as they replayed the scene in their minds. The insults, the pride, the cruel smirk. Some shook their heads slowly, unable to conceal their disappointment. Others wiped invisible sweat from their foreheads, grateful that they weren't the ones who had triggered such a disaster. The hall felt smaller, tighter, as though the air itself recoiled from the embarrassment choking the atmosphere. The aggressor felt their stares like needles on her skin, and each needle carried a message she didn't want to hear. The bridesmaids stepped back instinctively, putting space between themselves and the woman they had once supported with matching dresses and practiced smiles. Their withdrawal wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, a visual separation from disgrace. The aggressor's chest tightened as she realized she no longer had allies in this room. Even those who tolerated her sharp tongue now avoided her, unwilling to be connected to her downfall. The emotional distance stung more than any words could. And for the first time, she felt truly alone, trapped inside a spotlight she never wanted. A group of elders nearby exchanged glances heavy with cultural judgment, the kind that carries generations of values about respect, family, and honor. Their eyes held disappointment sharper than anger, the sort that pierces deeper because it reflects truth. To them, humiliating an elderly woman wasn't just rude, it was a stain on character, a sign of dangerous upbringing. The aggressor felt their gaze burrow into her soul, stripping away the layers she used to mask insecurity. And she sensed something far worse than embarrassment approaching: social rejection. A few young guests pulled out their phones again, not to record fresh footage, but to scroll through the earlier clips that had already spread through group chats. The aggressor saw their screens light up with her image, frozen in her worst posture, smirking at someone she had reduced to tears. She swallowed hard, realizing the moment was no longer confined to this hall. Technology had carried her humiliation beyond these walls, turning it into digital truth. And she had no control over how fast it would travel or where it would land. Two elderly women whispered from the corner, their expressions soft with empathy toward the old waitress, but stern with disappointment toward the aggressor. Their verdict, though spoken in low tones, carried the weight of collective morality. The crowd subtly gravitated toward the groom's mother, offering quiet nods, comforting gestures, and protective glances. Their shift in allegiance was unmistakable. The power the aggressor once wielded evaporated completely, replaced by a hollow emptiness she couldn't escape. And the growing support around the old woman only deepened her fall. The bride's childhood friend watched the aggressor standing alone in the middle of the hall, her once confident posture now folding inward under the crushing silence. It felt like the entire room had turned its back on her, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Every eye that avoided her delivered the same message. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The groom stepped farther away, his silence echoing louder than any confrontation. And as the room waited for the next move, one question lingered in the air: how would she survive this? The groom stood frozen beside his mother, his heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears as the reality of the moment settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The chandeliers above flickered softly, casting shadows that seemed to deepen his grief. His chest rose unevenly, each breath an effort as his mind replayed the cruelty he had just witnessed. He felt torn between the shock of betrayal and the instinct to protect the woman who had raised him with quiet strength. And as he looked at his trembling mother, he felt something inside him fracture beyond repair. His mother tried to steady herself, wiping her eyes discreetly with the edge of her sleeve, but the tremble in her hands betrayed the depth of her hurt. She stood small beneath the grandeur of the hall, her shoulders curled inward as though trying to hide from the weight of humiliation. Years of sacrifice, love, and resilience were stitched into her posture. He shifted his gaze toward the aggressor, and the space between them felt like a battlefield, silent, raw, and charged with betrayal. Her posture had collapsed, her confidence evaporated, and yet he could not find sympathy within himself. Not yet. The memory of her mocking tones still echoed through him like a sour note stuck in an unfinished symphony. He wondered how he had missed the signs, how he had mistaken arrogance for strength and cruelty for confidence. The weight of that realization settled heavy on his shoulders, deepening the ache in his heart. Guests watched as the groom placed a steadying hand on his mother's back, a gesture filled with tenderness and heartbreak. His fingers brushed against the fabric of her apron, grounding him in memories he wished he could return to, simpler days when she taught him kindness, humility, and respect. But now those lessons clashed violently with the behavior he had just seen from the woman he intended to marry. He felt the room tilt slightly, as though his entire foundation had shifted. And he knew the next decision he made would reshape everything. A sharp pain tightened in his chest as he noticed a tear slipping down his mother's cheek, glistening under the bright wedding lights. It wasn't just a tear of embarrassment. It was a tear of betrayal, of being mocked by someone she had silently hoped to welcome as family. The groom felt anger simmer beneath his grief, a quiet, protective fury that surprised even him. His mother had endured many hardships in life, but disrespect from her future daughter-in-law was a wound he had never imagined he would witness. And it hollowed him. He took a slow breath, trying to steady the storm swirling inside him, but the hall felt unbearably small. Every whisper, every glance, every phone recording reminded him of the humiliation his mother had suffered in front of strangers. The celebration he had dreamed of now felt like a cruel stage he had unwillingly stepped onto. The groom felt the world tighten around him, pressing him into a moment that demanded clarity, strength, and a painful kind of truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But time would not wait for him. The bride's childhood friend watched as the groom's eyes darkened with heartbreak, the kind that alters a person's spirit. She sensed he was on the brink of something irreversible, a decision that would change the course of the wedding and perhaps his entire life. The mother beside him tried to swallow her pain quietly, but it echoed through the room like a silent plea. The aggressor stood frozen in the distance, fearing the verdict forming in his heavy, hollow gaze. And the hall held its breath, waiting for the moment his heart would finally speak. The aggressor's heart thudded violently against her ribs as she watched the groom step back from her, creating a distance that felt wider than the hall itself. The lights overhead suddenly felt too bright, exposing every flaw, every trace of pride she once carried like an accessory. Shame clawed at her throat, urging her to speak, but fear held her silent. The world she carefully built, the poised mannerisms, the polished reputation, trembled beneath her feet. And she realized this moment would define more than her image. It would define her soul. The groom's mother clutched her apron gently, trying to steady her breathing as she stood beside her son. Her eyes lifted just long enough to glimpse the woman who had mocked her, and though her stare wasn't hateful, it was heavy with unanswered questions. The aggressor felt that look pierce through her composure, unraveling layers of excuses she once hid behind. For the first time, she saw herself through someone else's pain, and that reflection frightened her in ways pride could not shield. A choice, she realized, was rising before her like a mountain she wasn't prepared to climb. The crowd shifted subtly, forming a loose circle around the unfolding scene, their silence demanding accountability. Their eyes carried judgment, but also a sliver of hope that the woman they once applauded might find humility in the ruins she created. The aggressor felt every stare press against her skin, forcing her to confront the truth she had always avoided. Her actions had consequences. Heavy ones, irreversible ones. She inhaled shakily, sensing the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders like a cloak she didn't know how to remove. Her fingers shook as she clasped them together, each tremor a reminder of the crossroads standing before her. Pride whispered like an old friend, urging her to defend herself, blame stress, deny the cruelty she had inflicted. But a faint voice, one she had long ignored, spoke from somewhere deeper, urging her toward humility, toward acknowledgement, toward the hard, uncomfortable truth. She felt trapped between the person she had been and the person she might become, unsure which version of herself the world would accept. Yet the decision could no longer be delayed. The groom watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, but his eyes heavy with expectation. He didn't need to speak. His silence demanded sincerity more loudly than words ever could. The aggressor felt her chest tighten as she sensed what he was waiting for. Not excuses, not deflection, but responsibility. Something in his posture told her this was her final chance to show the character she claimed to have. One sincere act could shift the room. One dishonest act could burn every bridge she hoped to cross. The stakes sat before her, undeniable and steep. Her breath quivered as memories flashed through her mind. Moments where she belittled service workers, ignored advice, hid insecurity behind arrogance. She saw herself clearly, painfully, without filters for the first time. The realization stung her like a wound exposed to salt. She understood now that this wasn't just about the wedding or status or embarrassment. This was about who she was becoming in the presence of people she claimed to love. And the more the truth settled, the more her heart pushed her toward the difficult path she had never taken: honesty. The bride's childhood friend watched the aggressor's shoulders rise with a deep breath, her chest expanding with the weight of a decision that would shape everything. The hall grew impossibly still as she steadied herself, torn between clinging to ego or stepping into accountability. Guests leaned forward, waiting to see whether she would defend her pride or surrender it. The groom's eyes remained fixed on her, silently pleading for truth. And as the aggressor opened her mouth at last, everyone wondered whether this moment would lead to healing or complete destruction. A dense hush settled over the hall as the aggressor's breath trembled in the space between pride and surrender. The chandeliers above glowed brightly, almost too brightly, casting every detail of her shaken figure across the room. The groom's mother stood quietly beside her son, her tired eyes holding a mix of sorrow and strength. The crowd, once entertained by the spectacle, now waited with heavy hearts. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had transformed into a silent courtroom where character was on trial. And everyone braced for the verdict the moment would deliver. The groom's eyes flickered with pain, disappointment, and a quiet plea for truth, carrying a weight that made the aggressor's knees weaken. She felt the judgment of the entire hall press against her chest like a closing door. This wasn't about who was right or who was powerful. It was about who had shown humanity when it mattered most. The old woman wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sting of having her dignity stripped in front of strangers. And the aggressor realized this wound might never fully heal. Guests exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the moral lesson unfolding before them. Some held their breath, sensing that the groom might walk away. Others whispered prayers, hoping humility would bridge the gap pride had created. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the hall itself was suspending time. The aggressor's heart pounded violently, knowing her entire future balanced on the honesty of this moment. The friend watching from the side felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a revelation of who the aggressor had allowed herself to become. A wave of realization washed over the aggressor as she finally saw herself through the eyes of everyone present. The arrogance, the callousness, the blind pursuit of social dominance, all of it had led to this single, devastating moment. The groom's mother stood small but dignified, embodying the grace the aggressor lacked. The weight of the humiliation she caused settled heavy on her conscience. She understood now that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about facing the truth with sincerity. But sincerity felt like a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. The groom took a step closer to his mother, instinctively protecting her with his presence. The gesture was soft, yet powerful enough to shift the room's emotional gravity. The aggressor watched, her chest tightening as she realized what love looked like when it was rooted in respect. She had mocked the very woman who shaped the man she claimed to love. That truth pierced deeper than the stares surrounding her. The groom's silence spoke volumes. It declared that character mattered more than beauty, pride, or social presentation. And that truth left her trembling. A single tear finally escaped her eyes, tracing a path down her cheek like a confession she could no longer hide. It wasn't a tear of embarrassment. It was a tear of reckoning. She felt exposed, undone, humbled by the reality she created with her own actions. In that moment, she wished she could pull back time, undo the harm, erase the cruelty. But consequences don't bend to regret. They demand accountability. She inhaled slowly, preparing herself for the only path forward, even if that path led to losing everything she once held. The hall remained utterly still as the moment reached its peak, a quiet, powerful silence that would echo through memories for years. The aggressor's fate hung in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. The groom turned slightly, his body angled toward his mother, prioritizing her comfort over the illusion of celebration. And as the aggressor lowered her eyes, humbled at last, the crowd understood the moral truth revealed that day. Respect is the foundation of every family, and without it, love cannot survive. The wedding did not end as planned, but it ended with truth.